My paternal grandmother, who we called Baba Gita, was a uniquely tough woman. She was trained as a physical therapist in Soviet Lithuania, where she and my grandfather raised my father Sam and Aunt Fanya. She witnessed the atrocities of the Holocaust and endless anti-Semitism in Lithuania, and then moved to Israel, where she spent her golden years. Moved to Israel, where she lived through several wars and antifanyas, and buried my grandfather. She spent her golden years in Canada, living in her own apartment, and though she spoke 6 languages fluently, she never really learned English. Somehow, that never stopped Gita from living independently. She cooked and cleaned for herself. She was financially stable and wore 3-inch heels around the house, dyed her own hair brown. She was never shy to share her opinion, and was a direct communicator who saw the world in black and white. She either agreed with you or you were completely wrong. She was the kind of lady that shot from the hip and often shared her philosophies on what your life should look like, most often without any solicitation on your part. Though my grandma lived well into her 90s, she battled a blockage in her heart and an irregular heartbeat that required a pacemaker. There were days when I found her blocked heart to be more than just physical. Sometimes it was an emotional blockage as well. After what she witnessed in her life, I understood, or at least tried to. During our meditation, I was able to visit with her. I was sitting in her kitchen table in Toronto. She was serving me apples and toast and talking to me in Hebrew and Russian about how I ought to learn some opera, a legitimate art form. She punctuated the discussions by sharing snippets of her favorite arias. My mind then took me to my last visit with her. My wife Rachel, 2-year-old son Lev, and I visited her in the hospital. I remember seeing Gita on the hospital bed. She smiled broadly as we walked in, and there was a distinct clarity in her eyes. Rachel was 7 months pregnant with our second child. There was little small talk. We all knew this would be our last visit together. For Lev, seeing his great-grandmother lying in bed meant that she was going to sleep. So he suggested that we sing the Baba Gita, the lullaby that we wrote for him when he was born. So the 3 of us sang it together. The look of pride on her face widened when we finished the lullaby and Lev sang the words of the Shema. It's what we do every night before bed. And in what felt like an ancient biblical blessing, she told us how proud she was of us. And she delivered an impromptu benediction on our lives. We all embraced and said our goodbyes. Baba Gita's parting words to us were, "The baby will be a boy, and he will be a neshama tahora, a pure and special soul." And she was right on both counts. I will forever hold on to that image of my grandmother's loving expression. I am convinced that during our time with her, her soul had begun its journey to the next world. It felt as though we were tucking her in to her final resting place. Yizkor is the first and largest ongoing support group known to Jewish civilization. It's our chance to acknowledge the joy and the pain connected to our loved ones who have passed on. For some of us, our connections to the deceased are heartwarming in a white picket fence world of love. But for others, this service stirs up an emotional tempest of conflicting feelings. All are real, all are honored in this space. I'm amazed by people who change inherited parenting patterns. Hopefully, most of us have healthy, loving memories, but for all of you who have lived through painful upbringings and have been able to consciously break that cycle to raise your family in loving homes, you have changed your family's legacy forever. You remind us that even in the darkest of times, we can find rays of light. On Yom Kippur, we reenact our own deaths. We fast and pray. We recite the prayers that one says before dying, and we abstain from any intimate pleasures. Our collective memories are particularly powerful for this Yizkor service as it falls on this Day of Atonement. In my view, this day teaches us that the best way to remember the deceased is to live our lives to the fullest. So how are we at living it up? It's a curious thing. Some of us walk on the sunny side of life while others work hard to put one foot in front of the other. For some, it's uncomfortable to express unbridled joy. For some, lamenting is easier than celebrating. Have you noticed that our synagogue is overflowing with attendance for a heavy memorial service, while Simchat Torah, arguably our most celebrated holiday, is sometimes sparsely attended? How many of us will attend a Holocaust memorial service but feel less inspired to march in the Israel Day parade? Though I will say, after Rabbi Buchdahl's sermon, I think there will be many, many more of us. How many of us feel a sense of obligation to attend a baby naming or a bris, or will move mountains to attend a funeral? But how many of us feel little guilt about missing a friend's birthday party? But certainly we make it a priority to, God forbid, visit them in the hospital. So are we lousy at having fun? Are our hearts more open to loss than to celebration? Earlier we chanted the Shema and Ve'ahavta. These Torah texts have become central beliefs within our faith. Deuteronomy 6:6 reads, "And these words which I command you shall be upon your heart." Why would these words be on your heart rather than in your heart? The Kotzker Rabbi taught, sometimes these words lie upon your heart like a stone. And when the heart opens, in a special moment, they will enter. For some of us, remembering our family members and friends feels like a heavy weight on our heart. For others, the memory lives in the very center of its being. It feeds our body with the constant reminder that life is good, life is really good, and we are eternally blessed to learn from those who have come from us. Having attended hundreds of funerals, I have often walked away wondering, what would life be like if eulogies were read to the living? Recently, the world and media mourned the loss of Robin Williams. Had we given him the kind of love in his life that he had on CNN after his passing, could he have been rescued from his demons? Our language, Hebrew, is interesting. For cemetery, from what is otherwise a very linear language, we have 3 translations of cemetery. 1, Beit Kvarot, a house of graves. 2, Beit Olam, an eternal resting place. But for many, we draw on the translation of Beit Chaim, a house of life. The Hebrew language acknowledges that death belongs to life, that even in memorial, we celebrate the life of a person to the fullest. I loved my time with my grandmother. I love how perfectly flawed she was. I love that in her final days, she and her black and white perception of the world, she knew that she was ready to go, even though none of us were quite ready to let her go. During those final days, she moved to the very center of my heart, and she too became a neshama tehorah, a pure and lovely soul. Shortly after her funeral, my son Lev had questions about the finality of life. Having learned about his great-grandmother's death, he wanted to know, when could he be with her again? Didn't quite penetrate his mind. He wanted to know when Rachel and I would die. Would we leave him alone one day? We explained that his great-grandmother was resting peacefully and would live forever in the center of his heart. This had special meaning for him, given that the translation of Lev's name is heart. He accepted our answers, and in an age-appropriate way, he shifted the conversation to be about going sledding the next day. We were so appreciative of his ability to focus on a joyful activity, particularly after a day of such sadness. Having experienced a similar moment in parenting, Billy Joel wrote the following lullaby to reassure his daughter that she would never be alone in the world. Joel writes, "Inside this ancient heart, you'll always be a part of me. Someday, we'll all be gone, but lullabies go on and on.